Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a moment or two. Good evening. Good evening. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Happy Thursday. Hi, Marcia from Ocean Pines. Thanks for being here. Looks like we've got a good group filtering in here. Ooh, Richmond, Virginia. Linda from Nashua, thanks for joining us. I always love to hear where people are from. Deborah from Downeast, Maine. She's our official fact checker for tonight. Deborah, let's make that a private chat between you and me. um, we're up to 185. We'll just give another 30 seconds or so before we get started. Maybe some people are from some nice vacation houses right now, enjoying these kinds of gorgeous views of the Maine coastline or maybe the New England coastline, Cedar Island, North Carolina. Linda from Brooklyn, thanks for joining us. Nancy Parker from Chelmsford. Nancy, good evening. Great to have you here. And Chi, you as well from DC. We've got Yvette from Miami, Florida, Furlong, Pennsylvania, Natick, Bedminster, Phoenix, Arizona, Yorktown Heights, Jason from Boston. Thanks for being here. Hello from Baltimore, Maryland, West Hartford, Connecticut. Wow, we've got a great spread of people. Montclair, New Jersey, home of George Innes. Got me thinking now, George Innes. Gloucester, Port Washington, New York, the DC area, Air, Hicksville, Long Island, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Belmore, New York, Westbury, Massachusetts, Foxborough, Mass, Carlisle, Mass, Groton, Mass, Pepperell, Mass. Mass is very well represented tonight. Yarmouth, Port Cape Cod, Quincy Peninsula, Jacksonville, Florida, Fort Worth, Texas, Sharon, Massachusetts, Maynard, Massachusetts. This is a great list. Frank from Westport. Thanks for being here, Frank. Virginia from Carlisle, Sharon from Camden. I'm going to be giving so many shout outs to Camden tonight. North Chelmsford, Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts. And somebody says it seems like there's another audio track going. I'm really sorry about that. We're in webinar mode, so hopefully you can only hear me. And we also have Jan from Ontario, Canada, so we are international tonight. Okay, this is an awesome group going on tonight. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. So for all 230 of us, let's dive into some wonderful art. I want to thank the Chelmsford Library for being our anchor institution tonight, for hosting this event in partnership with several other libraries. I believe it's Tewksbury, Amesbury, and Groton, Massachusetts tonight. I could be wrong with that, but I'm very grateful to all of the great libraries that partner together to help to present my programs. And I am delighted to have your time and attention. We're going to feel like we took a little trip to Maine after this hour, because we are going to be looking at some of the best artists to ever produce art inspired by Maine. That is our Downeast connection. So artists have been flocking to Maine for centuries. They're inspired by the isolation, the seclusion, this romantic rocky shoreline that's there. And we'll be seeing plenty of that. Now, the image on your screen right now is by the artist N.C. Wyeth. This is his portrait of his own son, Andrew Wyeth. We'll be seeing more from both of these artists. But I thought it was a great way to get things started, because we can see a young artist standing right there on the rocky shoreline, struggling to capture the majestic beauty of all this ocean sea spray. Now, before we head into tonight's program officially, I just wanted to welcome you once again. If you've never been to one of these programs before, my name is Jane Oneail, and I own the company Culturally Curious. I specialize in art history and art appreciation lectures like this one. So if you're delighted by tonight's program, which I hope you are, you can always go to my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com, and give me feedback or sign up for the next virtual program that I'm giving. I think the next program that I'm giving is in person in Litchfield, Connecticut on September 4th at 3 p.m. and that will be on Claude Monet. That will be a lot of fun if you're able to join us. So you can find out more about that on my website. Let's get started with these artists inspired by Maine, our Downeast connections. Now, here is our overview for how we're spending this next hour together. We're going to get started just thinking about Maine as inspiration for these artists. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of these big name artists that we're going to see a number of times over the course of the evening. And then these are just essentially motifs that I use to help organize tonight's presentation. Instead of just going by period, by style, by artist, I thought I'd really mix it up. This is a little bit of a different format if you're familiar with the kinds of programs that I give, but I think it's a satisfying format too. You really sort of delve into Maine itself, I think, by way of the motifs. So we've got things like harbors and boats and work in the sea, but I can also promise you the things that you would hope and expect here are here. We're going to see loads of lighthouses, plenty of lighthouses. We're going to even have an unsolved mystery. So you have to hang on for that for tonight. And we'll see a couple of barrels of blood that are actually unrelated to the unsolved mystery. All right, so let's get started with Maine as inspiration. Kick back, imagine yourself in your very own Maine vacation house, okay? And we are going to get started with sort of the granddaddy of them all when it comes to Maine and art, and that is the artist Winslow Homer, who we can see here in a photograph from about 1880, just a few years before the artist kind of became a hermit, moved up to Prouts Neck, Maine in Scarborough, right on the water, and modified this carriage house that was in his family's property to function as a painting studio for him. And from that point forward, for the next several decades, he primarily paints the Atlantic Ocean from this scenic vista. And you can see that he actually added a wraparound second story porch to function as his studio. We should all be so lucky, right? And from that point forward, he just begins to create masterpiece after masterpiece. Let me give you a sense in terms of what they look like. Here is a gorgeous work that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's called Wood Island Light from 1894. And if you're wondering, where's that lighthouse? Where's Wood Island Light? It's just a little dab of red paint over here. Now, the wonderful story about this particular painting, and it is a classic Winslow Homer painting. We've got a little bit of the surf, we've got a little bit of the rocks, but in this case, we have this very evocative moonlight too. And apparently, he told this story to a biographer that the idea for this painting just kind of struck him like a bolt from the blue one day. And he ran inside his studio, got all of his painting materials, went right down to this rocky shoreline, and executed this painting in the course of about 5 hours. And from that point forward, he never retouched it again. It was just a masterpiece. And this was the way this man was producing works in the 1880s, in the 1890s. So he really kind of sets the stage for Maine as this idyllic artist retreat where you can get away from it all and it be inspired by the beauty. Now, as soon as he's cranking out masterpiece after masterpiece, you have all these other artists who are flooding to the state of Maine, and we begin to see what we know as artist colonies today. Now, how would you define an artist colony? It's basically like a loose association of artists that come together in the same geographic place. They don't even necessarily paint alike. They're just sharing this sense of company. So they're renting rooms at boarding houses. They're not formally involved with each other per se, but they're going to the same place because it's particularly beautiful and they know that it's going to be flooded with a number of other artists. So we're looking at a photograph over here on the left of an artist named Charles Woodbury from 1898. And he had a huge influence on the artist colony in Ogunquit, Maine. Now, it was already sort of a a targeted locale for artists. It's kind of right over the border. It's easy to access. But he began to, well, he opened up a school for painting and drawing, a 6 week summer course, basically, that he led every summer. And it was mostly women who were going up to Maine to learn from him. But he helped to establish Ogunquit as an artistic destination in the summer. And then to sort of outdo that a little bit, we have another artist named Hamilton Easter Field. And this is an example of Field's work over here on the right. He was a little bit more avant-garde, working on the cutting edge. And we can see here he had a kind of a loose approach to painting. He's really interested in the formal elements of these boats in the foreground with their primary colors and their stripes and that sort of thing. And then the texture of these weather-beaten gray shacks in the background. I think it's a really satisfying composition. So Hamilton Easter Field started going up to Ogunquit too, but he was bringing and inviting more avant-garde artists. So you've got these two different camps that are there that are really interested in the arts. You can imagine you probably couldn't like rub elbows with a single person in Ogunquit around 1910 without bumping into an artist there. Now, the one other major artist colony in Maine that I wanted to introduce you to is on the island of Monhegan. It's known as like the artist's island. And it was right around the same time in the early years of the 20th century that it became this major draw for artists. So Monhegan Island is a really small island. Depending on the source you're looking at, it's like 1 square mile to about 5 square miles, but it's about 10 miles off the coast of Maine from around Camden. And so what we're looking at over here on the left is a photograph of artists who were a part of that artist colony right around the turn of the century. I always get a kick out of seeing how artists used to dress, right? I'm going to put on my tie and my knickers here and go out and paint in the sunshine. And over here on the right, we have an example of what kind of painting was being produced on the island around 1910. This is done by the artist George Bellows. If the name sounds familiar, he's an American artist probably most closely associated with New York City and really gritty scenes of New York at that, boxing scenes, violent scenes. So we'll be seeing more from George Bellows over the course of the hour, but it's so interesting to me to get this other take on this artist who I associate more closely with a city life. And here he gives us this picturesque fishing village here. By the way, if after this hour you feel like you need to go to Monhegan Island, which apparently is still like every single view feels like a painting, there is an inn there. So I think we should all rent a room or something, rent the hotel out, I should say, next summer, because let me tell you, the allure is strong. So we've got these two artist colonies, we've got Winslow Homer, and then finally our last three artists that you really need to know who use Maine as inspiration is the artistic family dynasty of the Wyeth. So here on the far left, we have the patriarch of that family, N.C. Wyeth, who is probably best known as an illustrator who illustrated a number of children's books and magazine covers in the early years of the 20th century. And then he had a son named Andrew Wyeth, who became one of the most preeminent American artists of sort of mid-century and beyond. And then he had a son named Jamie, who is still alive today and who is also still closely associated with the state of Maine. So let's sort of go a little bit deeper with the Wyeths just for a moment. N.C. Wyeth, as the patriarch, sort of introduced his family to the state of Maine by way of a vacation house. The Wyeth family was from Chadds Pennsylvania, but they began to summer up in Cushing, Maine, around Cushing, Maine, or Clyde's Ford's Pencil, or sorry, Port Clyde, Maine. Around 1920 or so. And that's around the time that N.C. Wyeth purchased this house that he called Eight Bells. I love the tradition of giving your vacation house a name. But in this case, his vacation house was actually named after a Winslow Homer painting. So you can imagine this artist here who was an illustrator, a commercial illustrator, who always longed to be a great fine art artist is thinking, I'm going to Maine. I'm naming my house after this great Maine artist. He's like just immerse. I should say he's immersing himself in this artistic sensibility that existed in Maine, thanks to Winslow Homer. So we've got this nice little illustration of his vacation house. So then his son Andrew grows up going to Maine every summer, and not surprisingly, one of his most famous paintings, one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, Christina's World from 1948, was painted not too far away from Eight Bells, the vacation house that the Wyeth family went to. This is painted in Cushing, Maine. And just to be clear, this was painted by Andrew Wyeth when he was just 31 years old. This 1700s colonial farmhouse that we see in the distance, again, that sort of grayed, weather-beaten architecture here was classic seaside Maine, and it really drew in the artist here. He was much more fascinated by the house that you can see in the distance than by the owner of the house, who he eventually became really intrigued by, Anna Christina Olsen. So the end result, of course, is this woman lying here in this tall grass in the state of paralysis, sort of drawn to this house in the distance, but seemingly unable to access it or to move towards it. So an iconic painting of Maine. Maybe not everybody realizes that, but certainly inspired by the state where the Wyeth spent so much time. And then finally, I'd like to introduce you to the youngest of the Wyeths. This is Jamie Wyeth, Andrew Wyeth's second son, who was born into this artistic dynasty and was also spending his summers and a great deal of his time in Maine, and equally inspired. Now, Jamie Wyeth had a house on Monhegan Island, and this is a painting that he did. I think this is of the balcony of his house on the island of Monhegan, and we can see a portrait of his wife Phyllis sitting in profile on this massive throne-like wicker chair, and she is surrounded by all of these other pieces of wicker furniture that almost seem to be like coming into her space, intruding into her space here in an arrangement that is somewhat ominous, right? So there's a lot of Jamie Wyeth pictures, and several of which we'll see tonight, that have this aura of mystery around them, particularly these Maine pictures. This work was done in 1979, and it almost gives us a sense that Mrs. Wyeth here, his wife, was maybe in danger of being attacked by these spindly little pieces of wicker furniture on the deck here. All right, so let's turn our attention now to the sense of Maine as vacation land. And of course, people have been going to Maine for as long as we can remember, right? But shortly after the Civil War, the state of Maine began to advertise themselves, market themselves to the rest of the country as vacation land. And you can imagine if you were an artist working in Boston or New York in the early years of the 20th century, especially, Maine would have felt like nirvana. It was clean water, clean air. You get to escape all of the sanitation issues that you might find in the city. Yeah, I think every single one of us would make the trek up to the Maine coastline to make some beautiful art and just indulge in this sort of pure untouched nature there. So the first glimpse of a painting of Maine that makes it feel like vacation land, the first picture I selected for you is from Maurice Prendergast. Now, he is an artist that was known for these kind of delicate renderings of modern life that are characterized by these flat patches of color that sort of have this rounded form to them a lot of the time. They almost look like little mosaics. Now, Prendergast sort of moved up and down the beaches of New England. He's not necessarily closely associated with the state of Maine, but this is a painting, a little watercolor that's in a private collection called Stony Beach, Ogunquit from 1897. And this one just drew me in. I mean, the colors are really beautiful. And we have all of these figures standing on these stones, kind of moving between tide pools in this marshy area here. Notice how he unifies the images of the adult women who all have these red parasols. And then the children are wearing these beautiful little frocks and they all have their straw hats here. And our eye moves up this little canvas to see more and more of these stones and fewer of these figures. And then in the top register up here, we have this incredible control on the part of the artist to render the delicate reflections in the water of this pier at the very top with its red like boathouse at the end here. And then even beyond that, you can see some sailboats and that sort of thing there. So so we had this wonderful glimpse at like the busyness of Ogunquit, the way people are entertained and enjoying the natural splendors of Ogunquit at this time. Makes us all want to go to Ogunquit when we see a work like this. Now, not every vacation land picture is about the crowds. This is a wonderful summer image. It's simply called Summertime. It's by an artist named Frank Weston Benson, who was closely associated with the city of Boston. But every year for about 20 years, he moved his family up to North Haven Island off the coast of Maine, again, near Camden, Maine. And he had this island to himself that he could use as inspiration. So he would have his children and their friends pose for him. And in particular, this is a work that he really kind of slaved over. There's a number of studies of it. The final work is at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, executed in 1909. And I just wanted to share with you this sweet little review from a critic of the day who said, hidden somewhere in Mr. Benson's studio, I'm convinced there's a little jar marked sunshine into which he dips his brush when he paints his pictures of the summer. It is impossible to believe that mere paint, however cleverly laid on, can glow and shimmer and sparkle as does that golden light on his canvas. So we have this really kind of romantic, idealized scene here with these young women in these pristine white dresses, just hanging out on the edge of this island in Maine, one of them standing and gazing off into the sparkly distance. And you can practically feel the sunshine on your shoulders. You can feel the wind in your hair. We're all transported back to 1909 into what certainly seems like simpler times and such beautiful times. Now, this next image here, as it pertains to vacation land, is going back to this notion of kind of a crowded beach. And this is done by an artist named Walt Kuhn. Now, he's not as well known as some of the other artists that we'll be looking at today, but he was a major player in modernism in the United States in the first few decades of the 20th century. In fact, he was one of the artists that helped to bring the Armory Show to New York City, helped to introduce Americans to modernist European artists like Picasso and Duchamp. So he was doing inventive things, but he was also still spending his summers around Ogunquit. And so with his beach scene here from 1915, we can see that in the foreground, we've got these kind of gently curving sand dunes that just kind of envelop these figures in wonderful ways. And he softens and rounds out all of the forms in the foreground, from the hats to the parasols to the figures themselves. And then once again, we can see that there's this upper register, this top tier of the painting, where everything becomes triangular or sort of rectilinear. We have all of these formal triangles that are representing the sails of boats up above. So we've got this kind of quiet, sort of sedated crowd here in the foreground, and then this wonderful sense of structure up above. And what can at first seem like a little bit of chaos here, you begin to see there's like this rhythm and harmony to this particular work. I think it's really satisfying. The colors are just absolutely splendid too. Now, speaking of colors, we're going to switch gears here. And this is a really different idea of what Maine as vacation land might look like. This is done by a Japanese American artist closely tied to the state of Maine. His name was Yasu Kuniyoshi, and believe it or not, in the first decades of the 20th century, he was just as popular and as successful and as well known as artists like Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe. Unfortunately, I guess the history of art has not been as kind to Kuniyoshi as those other two artists. So he was living in New York City, and like I said, he was a super success. He was invited up to Maine by that Algonquin colony leader, Hamilton Chesterfield, or Hamilton Easterfield, I should say. And he began to create these kind of anxious images of summering in Maine. Notice how the water here is kind of gray and black, but we do have this very large bather here in the foreground with her red bathing suit. And she looks like she's having a pretty good time, right? But you have to begin to imagine that something's a little bit off here with the color of the water, the color of the sky. This is possibly York's Nubble Lighthouse in the distance. I think the architecture sort of matches here, and I think the scale and perspective almost suggests like a fable or fairy tale like quality to it that you sort of get the sense isn't going to end well for this bather here. There seems to be some kind of ominous lesson about swimming in the waters off the coast of Maine here, but really charming nonetheless, too. So we wrap up our view of Vacation Land with just one last image, and it's with an artist who is very closely associated with the state of Maine. His name is Alex Katz, and actually he has a big show at the Museum of Modern Art right now in New York City. I think it closes at the end of this month, so you can run down there tomorrow if you really like Alex Katz. Now, when my kids saw this, they thought it was Joe Biden swimming in the water, looking really happy. But this is a self-portrait of the artist. And this is somebody who is really familiar with the state of Maine. Alex Katz has a studio in Soho in New York City. And every summer he packs up and he heads up to Lincolnville, Maine, where he spent summers for, I think, half of a century. So here he is enjoying that natural splendor of Maine here. And we can see really broad brushstrokes to suggest that natural splendor, the sparkle off of the water, the reflection of the forest in the distance. And yet it does really give you that sense of the outdoors. And I think it makes me at least want to go for a dip. So he's captured something really wonderful in a picture like this one. It's really joyful, isn't it? So we'll turn our attention now to another favorite motif, I think, for a lot of people when it comes to the state of Maine, and that is bustling harbors and boats. Okay, our first image, I think that this is actually the oldest image in tonight's program, but I wanted to start with this one because virtually every major monograph on the state of Maine when it comes to art starts with this artist, and his name is Fitzhenry Lane. Now, he's another artist that's closely associated with the shoreline in New England. It's not that he lived in Maine. I think he's probably most closely associated with Gloucester, although he worked on a boat and was really familiar with the Atlantic coast. So he came up to Maine at one point in his career, right around mid-century, and he created this wonderful picture here of Owl's Head Light. And we can see, this great cross section of the kinds of boats that are in the harbor near Portland, Maine. Here we can see a steamer off in the distance. This is a fully rigged merchant ship just in front of it, and at the foreground over here we have a, 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 a coasting sloop here that the deck here is loaded up with firewood. And then on the far right, we have a fishing schooner. And notice how the water is incredibly choppy in this picture. And all of these boats are kind of being tossed and turned here, and all of their masts are at these wonderful diagonals, giving a great deal of energy to this picture and also kind of framing it up really nicely at the same time. You've got this wonderful structure kind of echoing those waves to a certain extent in the structure of the clouds in the sky. And then that lighthouse, Owl's Head Lighthouse, is right there, practically dead center in the picture as like the organizing principle to all of this. So Fitzhenry Lane gives us this great little peek into the past at the vitality of a Maine port like this, and gives us a sense of the different kinds of boats you'd be seeing at that time. This is about industry. This is about fishing. Let's turn our attention back to leisure for a moment, shall we? And we're going to turn our attention back to Weston Benson, or Frank Benson, who, as I mentioned before, had a home on an island off the coast of Camden, Maine, and and just as a fun fact, you can actually rent out that home. It's on Vacation Rentals by Owner. I'm not trying to pitch it to you, but it's actually kind of affordable. It's surprisingly affordable. So if you wanted to go be inspired by the same beautiful views as Frank Benson, you are more than welcome to go do that. Now, here is another example of Frank Benson using his children as models to depict kind of the beautiful splendor that was the Maine coast. And this is a work from 1904 called Calm Waters. It's in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. In the foreground, we have this little dory that his three children are in. Notice how it's set at this diagonal, leading our eye back into the distance. Frank Benson is pretty closely associated with American Impressionism. So there's this looseness to his brushwork and an interest in diagonals like that that would have come from French Impressionism. So here it's all about the light. It's like the light has bleached out the hair of his son. It is cascading down the back of his daughter here in the foreground. I think that's Eleanor. And then it just lights up the inside of this boat. Our eyes can go back to like the sailboats and the dory in the background, and we sort of like dart around the water that way, but the waters are really calm. We come back to this boat in the foreground with his beautiful children, and I just particularly love this seafoam green passage here in the foreground, where we're just kind of like peeking below the surface of these calm waters. And notice how the colors that he chooses perfectly complement the pink of his daughter's dress here. So this is very much a constructed image and a really successful one. He loved the result. He declared it his best out of door work. And I think it's another picture that just kind of transports you to that sense of vacation and leisure time by way of a nice boat here. So the next boats we're going to be looking at, considering, are by the patriarch of that Wyeth family of artists. This is by N.C. Wyeth. It's called The Harbor at Harringott. It was executed in 1925. And this was, for N.C. Wyeth, it felt like a breakthrough. He was really trying to break away from commercial illustration. And this felt like an interesting way, an interesting approach to painting fine art. So he gives us a slightly surreal vision of this port that would have been really familiar to him. This was very close to his vacation house. And in some ways, it almost feels like a collage. We've got all these wonderful things happening, from the lobster pots, the lobster traps, I should say, over here on the left, the giant seagulls in the foreground. We've got this little path over here on the right with a figure walking down it, kind of leading our eyes into the picture. But we also have this pier sticking out into the water. The thing that makes this picture a little bit surreal, beyond these beautiful pastel colors that he was using, are these very large uh, fishing boats in the foreground. And you can see these like athletic fishermen who are standing and rowing these boats. This one over here also filled with the lobster traps. Notice how that there are all these seagulls kind of dive bombing the boat. And then we have all these other boats beyond that. Another steamer over here, this giant sailboat in the middle distance here. And it gives us the sense that all of these boats are rendered without a great deal of attention to scale and perspective here. It almost gives it like a fairy tale like quality again. And for Wyeth, he thought, this is a breakthrough. This is potentially how I would paint now. And that break with traditional scale and perspective, I think, is also achieved by some of those seagulls at the top center of the picture. So we've got these different clusters of seagulls here. A great deal of activity. I think it's such a pleasing image. It's a place that you feel like you want to go to and see for yourself. So our last image of a bustling harbor I wanted to share with you is one of my favorite favorites and a favorite for a lot of people's, John Marin. Now, he began to visit Maine in 1914. He went for regularly throughout his career, and he's closely associated with a couple of different towns. This is the town of Stonington. In the background, we've got this nice hill with the suggestion of all of these buildings. But the star of the show here is the sailboat that is at the center of the composition. At least that's what we can surmise it is, right? Because he's just using these bold, fragmented lines to suggest not only the sailing vessel, but all of the energy of the sea at this point. So we've got this kind of curving shoreline here that brings us into the picture, some choppy waters. Some of the choppiness is suggested with triangles that sort of stick up and then triangles that also stick off to the sides. Notice that he's painted the sky using very different and unexpected colors too. We've got this like streak of yellow at the top of the composition. Maybe that's a sunrise or a sunset. And then notice these white sort of like staples in the sky. Maybe those are clouds, maybe those are seagulls, they could be anything, but John Marin creates these fascinating compositions that just kind of bring you in and get you really interested in what he was trying to achieve and state with a sort of dynamic and abstracted composition like this. All right, so we have our sense of boats. Let's turn our attention now to work and the sea. So all of these artists that are flocking up to me, one of like the most available subjects to them were the people that were who lived there, who were making a living out of fishing and lobstering. So let's take a look at what some of those images look like. This is, I love this picture. It's by the New York City-based artist Emil Holzhauer, and he was closely associated with the Monhegan Island artist colony. He was really drawn to that island for its remote beauty, but it was a working fishing village too. So he, all around him are all of these fishermen hard at work, and he created mending nets in 1928. And we have this tight configuration of these four men. It's like their knees are practically touching, their heads are bowed, and they're doing this work with their hands, fixing these nets so that they can hop on the boat, maybe that's right behind them here, and go out into the water. And you can imagine if you're an artist there from New York City and there to commune with other artists, this sense of these men here, these hardworking men who are doing things with their hands in a collegial fashion, he probably had this sense that like these fishermen are kind of similar to these artists here too, doing this very detailed, fine work with their fingers here. So I think there's like a sense of solidarity there. Now, I mentioned the artist George Bellows before, the New York City artist who was known for his boxing pictures. He was also closely associated with Monhegan Island, as I mentioned. These are known as the headlands of Monhegan. We'll be seeing them several more times. It's like this famous cliff face on the island of Monhegan. I think it's like somewhere between 100 and 150 feet of like granite. It's just a drop off here, slightly abstracted in this picture. But George Bellows is giving us a sense of like the heroism of these fishermen who are all working in coordination to drag this boat into the water. And the way he's painted them, with these their bodies at these dramatic diagonals here, is just as dramatic as one of these boxing images that he was creating in New York City right around the same time. He's organized this by color, I think, in a really satisfying way, from like the reddish rocks in the foreground to the red stripe of the boat, the yellow rain slickers, and then all of this green and blue in the water and the sky here. It's a really loosely painted picture, but I think it's a really successful one. Now, somebody else who loved the subject of local fishermen and lobstermen was the artist N.C. Wyeth, who's the patriarch in that family of artists. This is his painting of a Maine fisherman that he did in 1933. Now, the fisherman that he painted was actually friends with the artist's son, Andrew Wyeth. And so we actually know who this is. His name's Charlie Stone. He was a Port Clyde fisherman. And here he is looking rather heroic, right? I mean, he's a young, a good looking guy with like a, a defined jaw here. He's got the baseball cap with his eyes in shadow, gazing off to the horizon. And I think these big pink clouds in the distance just like reinforce this kind of sentimental, romanticized vision of this hardworking lobsterman, right? A kind of tough guy here. And it's almost a little too saccharine. So what we'll see is within the space of about a decade, in the midst of World War II, N.C. Wyeth's approach to painting Maine lobstermen really changes. And if you've ever been to the Portland Museum of Art up in Maine, you've probably seen this work and it probably stopped you in your tracks. It's a really stunning painting. It's called Dark Harbor Fisherman. Doesn't that sound so mysterious? So we're standing on this vantage point here, probably up on the dock, looking down on these four little boats with these four fishermen, and all of their heads are bowed. We have no idea who they are. They're kind of hard at work, but there's something about this like inky black water here and the unknown nature of who these men are and really what they're up to that makes all of this just a little bit suspicious or something mysterious. What we do see is the figure that's closest to us is standing knee deep in a boat full of herring, and he's scooping them up into these baskets. We can see that there are dozens of seagulls here, eager to kind of swoop in. Now, I've always loved the mysterious nature of this work, obviously, but I was really kind of tickled when I was researching it a little bit more. Apparently, N.C. Wyeth had originally named the painting simply Herring with an exclamation point, like it was a Broadway show. So I guess he wasn't aiming for mystery, but whoever renamed this work, I think, hit the nail on the head because there's just something wonderful happening here. Now, it, N.C. Wyeth was often kind of outdone by his prodigy son, Andrew Wyeth. So we're going to shift gears and take a look at what his son was painting right around the same time. It's a nighttime scene, not of fishermen, but in this case, a lobsterman. And Andrew Wyeth painted this just a year later, 1944, when he was just 27 years old. And it is a knockout of a painting, right? We can see this lobsterman. The only light that we have in this painting is presumably a lantern that's behind the lobster trap. And then all of this like bioluminescence, this phosphorescence in the water. And after like a moment on reflecting on the beauty of that, we begin to wonder, why is this happening at night? Why don't we see this lobsterman's face here? And we realize that, of course, this is somebody who's stealing from the lobster traps. Andrew Wyeth named this work Night Hauling, but apparently originally had thought about calling it poaching. He thought that that was just a little too literal, so he opted for night hauling. And I think that's great. It doesn't give away anything. It lets us just discover how mysterious this work is. Now, I promised an unsolved murder at the beginning of the hour. We're still going to get to that. There's still darkness ahead. But for now, we've seen a lot of men in boats so far. Let's switch it up and look at a lady in a boat for a moment. We're thinking about work and life on the sea. What is happening in this painting? Well, this is a work by the artist Marguerite Zorak, who I just adore. And this is a work from 1940. It's also at the Portland Museum of Art. And she called this painting Diana of the Sea. Now, Zorak had been summering in the coastal town of Georgetown for about 2 decades by the time she had painted this. So this is somebody who obviously knows the Maine shoreline. I wonder how often did she see naked women in little fishing boats like this? Obviously, this is an imagined composition of this lovely nude woman. And you can see that she's wrapped in this blanket. The inside of the blanket has stars and moons in it. And that might explain why she's not at all fazed by like the giant lobster or lobsters or the crab or the starfish here, because she is a representation of the goddess of the hunt. and who is typically associated with the crescent moon, like we see here. So in this case, the goddess of the hunt is there to help out the fishermen and the lobstermen, right? It's hard to say if she is the bait or the catch in this case, but we've got this wonderful, masterful mix of modernism and mythology in this image. And it's just a really different approach to this familiar subject. Now, this next image, it's a little bit hard to look at, but I chose it because the color palette is so different. And yes, we are looking at barrels of blood here, blood of fish. This is not our unsolved murder yet. This is a painting by the artist James Fitzgerald. It dates to about 1960, and it's called Salton Mackerel. So we have these fishermen that are hard at work. We can see that they're on a beach setting here, and the shoreline is just at the top of the image, the boat up here in the upper right, and we can see this almost circular formation of these fishermen who are kind of wrapped around this cluster of barrels here, who are treating the fish so that they can then be sold. And I think one of the things that I love most about this composition is that circle of figures, and then just above them, the circle of the seagulls who are just kind of like waiting there in formation to dive bomb as the moment presents itself. I also kind of love this the way he's mixed in the little bit of the white paint on the surface of this barrel of red blood here. So again, it's all painted with this wonderful kind of masterful looseness, and it really, I think, conveys a sense of the work that's being done and the movement involved with it as well. So we'll wrap up this section on work and the sea with a nod to another Maine artist named Bernard Langley. Now, he is probably most famous for his wooden sculptures, much more large scale than this. This is like a wooden sculpture collage, basically. But Langley kind of used the forests and the fields of Maine as his artistic playground, and he would create these very large totem-like sculptures of various kinds of animals. And if you're interested in his kind of work, you can actually, there's like an art trail through like 55 Maine communities where you can go and see his sculptures. This is just a little introduction and a nice little segue using the seagull here as our linchpin, but it gives you a sense of the kind of vibrant, sort of humorous, and also rustic approach to sculpture that was Bernard Langley. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to a new topic. This is rocky coasts and sandy shores. And this is, I think, the subject that so many Maine artists focus on, or artists visiting Maine. This is really where the artist Winslow Homer excelled. I mean, there probably wasn't a rock south of Ogunquit or York that he didn't paint. So when you're up there and you go to a place like the Cliff House and you have a cocktail, you're looking out at rocks that look exactly like this. And he loved to paint them, especially in stormy weather. This is a work that is called The Coast of Maine from 1893. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago. And we can see those rocks are absolutely beaten down through this like storm here. These little spindly trees, these leafless trees are holding on for dear life in the storm. There's a sea spray here and just the tiniest glimpse of the actual ocean itself. Look at the color of the sky. So this is Winslow Homer at his best, showing us just how terrifying and powerful the ocean is. And there were countless artists that tried to recreate just this kind of painting. But the next artist I want to introduce you to gives us sort of a cross section. He can give us very placid waters, and then he can give us kind of a churning ocean as well. These are two paintings by the artist Rockwell Kent, very closely associated with Monhegan Island Artist Colony. He actually painted this work over here on the left in 1905, simply called it Monhegan Island. We've got the calm waters. Maybe this is like the first light of day. day. This beautiful light on the horizon here, illuminating the Monhegan headlands. And then about 45 years later, he paints this very different view of almost the exact same site with the waves crashing on the rocks in the foreground. And then look at how interested he gets in the faceting of the rocks here. It's almost like its own little cubist painting, which I also really appreciate. Now, here's something really interesting you should know about Rockwell Kent. So he spent a lot of time on the island of Monhegan. He actually built several houses there as well. In 1953, there was a woman, I think she was a former client of his, maybe he painted a portrait of her, but she was kind of like a New York City socialite, maybe just a divorcee, but she was there. She was staying in one of his houses with, I think, a few of her relatives and said, I'm going to go for a walk to the headlands. And then she was never seen again. People claimed that they heard a woman scream something like, "Get your hands off of me." But she most certainly fell down that 150-foot cliff. Her body was found, I think, 3 weeks later out to sea. And so this is like this mysterious, tragic death that has always been linked to Rockwell Kent, our artist here, because it was his house. So the artist, Jamie Wyeth, the youngest in that artist dynasty, Jamie Wyeth became fascinated with Rockwell Kent. When Jamie Wyeth sold out his first show of art, he bought one of Rockwell Kent's houses on Monhegan Island. And then he began to collect Rockwell Kent's paintings. And then Jamie Wyeth created this posthumous portrait of Rockwell Kent on the island of Monhegan. And look what's happening in the background. It is that woman falling off of the cliffs, falling off of the Monhegan headlands there, that unsolved death, that mysterious murder, possibly, that has been forever linked to Rockwell Kent because she was staying at his house. P.S. Rockwell Kent wasn't even on the island when this woman died, but again, it's always been linked back to him. So Jamie Wyeth creates this fascinating posthumous portrait of Rockwell Kent. I think he did this in 2013. So forever linking Rockwell Kent to that death and to himself, Jamie Wyeth, as well. And I have to say, I've never seen another painting like this with somebody falling to their death in the background in such a way. So our last image from this category here, not a rocky coastline, but a sandy shore. And as audacious as Jamie Wyeth's painting was that we just saw, this is an understated painting. And this is by his father, Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth once said, "Most artists look for something fresh to paint. Frankly, I find that quite boring. For me, it's much more exciting to find fresh meaning in something familiar." And that's exactly what he's done in this painting called River Cove from 1958. It's a photorealistic picture of just this small slice of nature where we can see in this pile of sand here familiar shells, the prints of birds that were walking on that wet sand. You can practically like feel the texture of that sand itself. He allows us to peek past the surface of the water into this shallow space right here where there are more shells and rocks. And then our eyes kind of swoop up to the top of this composition where it's now just reflection. We can see the reflection of the trees in the distance. So he's inverted our natural sense of a landscape painting. He's put the trees at the top instead of at the bottom, the land at the top here. But he is giving us something that is breathtaking in terms of its attention to the tiny details of nature here. It almost makes you feel like you're right there in Maine on an overcast day, digging your own toes into this kind of sand here. Okay, so now we're turning our attention to making waves. And this is something that has always just particularly fascinated me. I just am forever in awe at artists' ability to capture like roaring waves, the churn of water, the way they do that with color, with form. It it's a marvel to me. So we'll begin this section with two works here by George Bellows, once again, closely associated with Monhegan Island. You can probably already recognize that cliff face there, but take a look at the way he's painted these kind of roiling sea in both of these images. I love the colors he's chosen, lots of greens here, some periwinkle, and just even like the motion of his brush as he lays in these ribbons of color. I think in these two works, what I particularly appreciate is this green section down here in the bottom right, and the way he's kind of laid in the white edges here, suggesting that foam with these tendrils of color. It's just beautiful, masterfully done. Now, our next image of making waves comes to us by way of Andrew Wyeth. We just saw his quiet little cove there. Now, he was also a masterful watercolorist, and that's what we see in this painting here called Marshall Point Lighthouse from 1940. So he's in his 20s at this point, and he is just well, he's doing remarkable things with this familiar Maine motif, right? The lighthouse here. He brings us into this picture as though we are on the rock with him, this little tidal pool right here at the foreground. And then once again, he's using just a sort of a bare minimum of different blues and greens here to and uses like a gently undulating line to suggest those waves. But it's the way he's captured this remarkable like sea spray, these crashing waves that kind of beautifully frame up that lighthouse there. It's all just majestic and it's artfully done. It's not like painfully symmetrical. It's not labored that way, but it gives you this kind of expert view of a familiar Maine motif. It's just done really well. Now, this is a really different approach to the subject of crashing waves in a lighthouse. This is done by the artist Marsden Hartley, and he is really one of the forerunners in American modernism. He was born in Maine. He returned to the state throughout his career. This is probably inspired by Portland Headlight, the oldest lighthouse in Maine, and this is simply called the Lighthouse from 1940. And I love what he's done here. The lighthouse, it's framed by these big familiar looking rocks, kind of a takeoff of Winslow Homer, but he leaves all of this white space for that, like the crashing waves. And these crashing waves, he suggested the power of them because he's kind of set his lighthouse at a slight diagonal here. You almost feel like these waves have like pushed the earth off of its axis. They're so incredibly powerful. And then the rest of this is just done with this wonderful sense of modernist painting, how everything's outlined with the black outlines here, and the buildings are rendered with minimal detail. Everything is abstracted in a wonderful way. It's just a fantastic painting. Now, our next look at crashing waves comes to us by way of Jamie Wyeth. So Jamie Wyeth, who just gave us that figure falling off the Monhegan headlands, gives us another strange series of paintings from the year 2009. That is when his artist father, Andrew Wyeth, passed away. And so Jamie Wyeth thought he would do a series of paintings about his artistic mentors inspired by dreams that he had. And so he does a series of them, and in each subsequent work, he removes one of the mentors. So with this work, which is called The Sea Watch, he has his grandfather and his father standing on the rocky coast of Monhegan Island. Look at how he's made the water kind of fuchsia and almost olive green over here. The way he's painted the waves, I think, is just like spectacular and really evocative. But over here on the left, one of the mentors that he has included, and I just love this detail, that's Andy Warhol, just looking on. And in another version from this series, he still has Andy Warhol, his father and his grandfather, but he's also included Winslow Homer, just kind of walking around with his cane too. So he gives us a really different interpretation of the sea. Now, when it comes to making waves, it doesn't always have to be about crashing waves and all the drama, because sometimes artists can interpret the main waves in a completely calm and peaceful way. So say hello to Georgia O'Keeffe. These works were painted in 1922 on the left and 1927 on the right. O'Keeffe started visiting Maine in 1920, right around the time she was starting to make it really big in New York City, which was a place that she didn't necessarily feel comfortable. Her biographer said, for Georgia, the trip to Maine was a revelation. Standing at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, she felt the bliss of a wide, flat horizon, a sense of boundlessness and solitude. And of course, if you're familiar with Georgia O'Keeffe, that's what she eventually finds out in the deserts of New Mexico. So here she softens forms, she creates these very subtle undulating lines, and she gives us this sense of like peace and restoration that I think a lot of people feel after a day at the ocean. So everything's kind of subtle and understated here. Her fellow male artists were so jealous of what she was doing. The artist Arthur Dove said, "This girl is doing naturally what many of us fellows are trying to do and failing." And I have to say, I love these works. These are works that, you could live with, and they would give you that sense of peace and calm of visiting the ocean. Oops, sorry, here we go. One last image for Making Waves. This is from the Maine artist Ashley Bryan. And this is a gorgeous, serene collage from 2015. Now, Ashley Bryan was an art teacher at Dartmouth College, and when he retired from his position in the 1980s, he moved to Islesford, Maine, on Little Cranberry Island. And throughout his long life and long career, he focused on creating illustrations through collage that celebrated Black life and Black creativity. So this is part of a series that he did for an illustrated version of Langston Hughes poetry about water, like rivers and the ocean and rain and that sort of thing. So this is cut paper that forms these bands of color. We have sort of a midline here where the land and sky are above and the water is below, and we have this woman with long hair and this long flowing dress holding her infant in such a way that he can probably see his reflection. And just notice the wonderful ways he suggested the reflection of their forms in the water, the colors that he's chosen here. These cool colors and this kind of like gently rippling water seems a world away from Winslow Homer and the pounding waves and really powerful storms that we saw before, but I think it is every bit as successful and evocative here. All right, so we have just a few more sections, maybe two more sections, and they're very short and sweet. So this next section is called Coastal Light. And we're going to go back to Winslow Homer for just a moment because he's sort of our anchor for all things. Now, I spent the 4th of July this year by the ocean, and I think July 5th, that whole weekend, it was pretty murky. It looked a lot like this. And this is kind of like this special light effect that you get when the coastline is just buried in fog. And so this is Winslow Homer's painting called The Artist Studio in an Afternoon Fog from 1894. This is at the University of Rochester. And so we can see the sun just barely breaking through. The sky is this kind of muddied grayish brown color. We can see the artist's familiar second story painting studio here, that wraparound porch. And you know that this is like a special painting because Winslow Homer has turned his attention away from the ocean back towards the land to capture this particular quality of light. Art historians love it. They think it is like the most contemplative of all of Winslow Homer's paintings, and it really does transport you to a foggy day by the ocean. Now we're going to lift the fog for a moment and take a look at the brilliant sunshine. It's almost hard to look at now. This is a painting by the American Impressionist Child Hassam, and he went to the Isles of Shoals every summer for 30 years, trying to paint it and capture these familiar spaces on the Isles of Shoals in the same way that his idol, the French Impressionist artist Claude Monet, would go to a motif and paint it again and again, different times of day, different atmospheric effects. So here with a painting like this one, Child Hassam is really interested in trying to capture the almost like flickering effects of light off of these wet stones on the Isles of Shoals. In some ways, he almost makes it feel weightless because it is just about capturing the light reflecting off of the rocks here. It's bright. It's really cheerful. I love it. He always makes the Atlantic Ocean like pure blue color. It makes you want to travel out to the Isles of Shoals. Now, this next image of coastal light is really different. This is going back to Rockwell Kent once again. And Rockwell Kent, when he first went out to Monhegan Island, he was so taken with it that after 2 summers there, he decided to spend the entire winter there. And he was working with the fishermen, trying to like eke out an existence. So he probably knew the water, the quality of light there better than any other artist working on Monhegan. And with this work called An Afternoon on Sea from Monhegan from 1907, we have like this lemon yellow sky here as the sun is setting behind this icy rock. And look at the way it glistens off the water here. It is absolutely magnificent, isn't it? And the colors that he's choosing here, from the purple in the shadow here on the snow to the blues in the water. I think this work just sings to me every time I see it, as does this last work from this section here. This is a knockout, isn't it? This is probably the painting I could really live with and look at every day. This is a painting by an artist also associated with Monhegan. Philip Shoemaker owned a studio on Monhegan Island, and you can tell that this is someone who really studied these atmospheric effects of light and shadow. So here we have the clouds kind of uh, pressed together at the top center, and literally that silver lining as the light of the sun kind of breaks out around the edges of those clouds. And look at how it illuminates the water down below. It makes it almost blinding. And then he's using these beautiful buttery brushstrokes to bring the water into the shoreline here. Philip Shoemaker actually wrote a book a few years after he painted this called How to Paint the Sea, and I think this guy knows a thing or two about doing that. So our last section here is called Quiet Places. And this is really what Maine is all about in the end, right? It's like, it's vacation land, sure. It's like the crashing waves, it's all of that. But I think when people go to a remote place, they're looking for that sense of solitude. They don't want loud neighbors, right? They want to be alone with their thoughts and the beauty that exists around them. So the artist probably most closely associated with quiet places is, of course, Edward Hopper. And most people don't necessarily associate him with Maine. He had a house on Cape Cod, but he went up to Maine and he painted as many lighthouses as he could. This is called Two Lights Lighthouse, which is on Cape Elizabeth. This was painted in 1927. So Hopper is not going for the drama. He's not giving us soaring surf or rocky cliffs or any sort of dramatic weather. It's just a blue sky. But there is a great deal of light and shadow here. It almost feels like there's like a giant standing here casting these huge shadows across this field. Edward Hopper once famously said, "Maybe I'm not very human. What I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house." And in this case, this lighthouse offered him the opportunity. It's a little bit mysterious, but it certainly is a very quiet retreat here. So one of our last paintings, Another Very Quiet Place, comes to us by way of Andrew Wyeth. He's also known for his depictions of these very sort of quiet spaces of solitude. Now, if you've seen some of my other programs, you know that Andrew Wyeth sort of partnered with his wife, Betsy. They were artistic collaborators, and sometimes she would create these little still life vignettes for him to paint, set them up around the house. In this case, the couple bought a house on an island off the coast of Maine called Allen Island. And Betsy Wyeth, the artist's wife, actually helped to dig out this little pond here simply for the reflective opportunities it would provide for her husband's painting. And in this case, the reflection of that crescent moon and that brilliant planet there, that's Jupiter. The name of the painting is Jupiter from 1994, create like a slam dunk of a painting. It's just gorgeous. And of course, there's no signs of life here. We feel like we've been like walking through the woods and we've like emerged here out into this breathtaking space with the evening sky reflecting in the water, the waves crashing in the distance. And we've found nirvana, right? We're on the edge of the world and it's just so gorgeous. So we'll wrap up tonight with one last painting from Georgia O'Keeffe, this like minimalist masterpiece. In the spring of 1928, Georgia O'Keeffe was back in Maine visiting York Beach, and she painted this work called Wave Night. It's minimal but dramatic, and Night Wave, or Wave Night, I should say, is a rare nocturnal seascape that's painted in these kind of inky blacks and blues. We've got a little bit of like purplish pink here down at the bottom. And of course, these are not roaring waves. This is the opposite of Winslow Homer. These are the waves that kind of gently lap the ocean, or the shoreline, I should say, gently lap the shoreline as everybody else is sleeping. And Georgia O'Keeffe walks us out to the water in the middle of the night. Notice how the water actually comes out of the frame here. It's like our toes are right there in it. You can practically feel that cold water, and it's this beautiful sense of peace that Georgia O'Keeffe gives us in a painting like this that invites us to kind of commune with nature here. So we'll wrap up with just a couple of big ideas really quickly. And you can tell I'm a sucker for that seafoam green. I'm using it to unify all of our pictures. Tonight we've had the opportunity to see the wonderful variety of ways that artists have responded to Maine as inspiration. We've seen stormy skies and rough seas. We've seen exquisite light and leisure, and we've seen these peaceful contemplative works that restore the viewer and remind us that of the state's incredible natural beauty. Hopefully tonight has felt like a little vacation along the Maine coast, getting to know some of the country's best artists in the various ways the beauty of Downeast, Maine has influenced their work over the years. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me. We'll open it up to questions. I'll start looking at the Q&A and see what I can do to answer you. Ellen, great question. About 15 minutes in, she said, are there any female artists during this time? A great question. I tried to include a few. We saw Marguerite Zorak. We saw Georgia O'Keeffe, obviously. I'm not sure if we saw too many others, but it's always good to ask about women artists. So thank you for sharing that. And I tried to include a few. Mary Zoll says, in that photo of NCY, he looks Black, African American, or is that just a result of his deep tan? Maybe he just spent too much time in the Maine sunlight. I don't believe that's part of his heritage, but I could be wrong. Catherine says, Jane, are you following new artists emerging in the 21st century? Will you recommend galleries in Maine? Catherine, I will admit that I'm not as familiar with emerging artists right now, but I just gave this presentation in Maynard, Massachusetts last week. And it seemed, I joked to them that it felt like everybody in the room had a vacation house in Maine. They were very familiar with the art from Maine. And a lot of people advocated for the museum at Colby College that seemed to have sort of a rich and wide variety of Maine art. So that might be a good place to start looking, Catherine. I'm sorry, I'm not more familiar. Nothing on Neil Welver. Sharon, he didn't make the cut. He was in there, but I stayed closer to the shoreline. His pictures are so much in the woods. He just didn't make the cut. He's probably just at the end of my presentation, and I just didn't include him. Sorry about that. Sorry you didn't get to see a little Neil Welliver, but I do love and appreciate his work too. Jennifer says, where are the best places to see artwork like these in Maine? Well, I love the Ogunquit Museum. Any reason you can go to Ogunquit is always a good one. It seems as though there is a Monhegan museum as well. And I think I just learned that Jamie Wyeth has given like $1 million to that collection. So that might be something to look for. Obviously, the Portland Museum of Art too, and Colby Museum, those would be great repositories for Maine art. Thanks for the kind words from the anonymous attendee. And it seems I'm just going to head over to the chat. Thank you, everybody, for the very kind words. Oh, Catherine added that Rockwell Kent illustrated Moby Dick in 1930. Yes, I mean, this was a man who knew his oceans, right? Thanks for sharing that, Catherine. I'm just going to go back a little bit further just to see. Okay, let's see. um, Marin's paintings yellow looks like deconstructed sailboat waves trying to get along. I like that interpretation, Beatrice. Thanks for adding that. And Karen said, can we add the artist names to the paintings in the recording of this section? That might be a little bit tough, but if you wanted the artist names, feel free to reach out to me on my website. I am culturallycurious.com, and I'd be more than happy to email them to you. And oh, we've got a big fan of Frank Benson here. And maybe I should focus on that. And then somebody asked, do fish have red blood? Has great question. Apparently Jan says yes. I don't know fish well enough to. I don't even eat seafood. I wouldn't even know. But according to James Fitzgerald's painting, they do. Thank you for all of the kind words here. Oh, Nancy, you're so sweet. And I really appreciate everybody's time and attention, and I really appreciate your very, very kind words. We are in for a treat together next month when we come back together, because we're going to be looking at the artwork of Leonardo da Vinci together. Oh my God, we'll go deep on that. Oh, Linda asked, can I recommend any books? I would recommend looking at, there were a couple of books on Monhegan Island, but it's really the Farnsworth Museum that was like a great resource to me. And I was just using the books at my local library. There were several texts on the Farnsworth collection. I would recommend starting there. It was great. Thank you, everybody, for this little fun trip to Maine. It seems like people are having fun with it. Um, let's see. Trisha says, uh, love that painting of Afternoon on the Sea. Maybe it's at the Smithsonian. Let me see if I have that in my notes. I believe that Rockwell Kent, if we're talking about the same one, Trisha, is at the Fine Art Museums of San Francisco. Just have to take a little plane trip across the country to see it. Oh, Jean, thanks for mentioning the tours of Wyeth's or of Winslow Homer Studio, which it's available to the public. You can buy a ticket to visit his studio in Prouts Neck, Maine, through the Portland Museum of Art. You start the tour there, and they bus you out to that location so you can see where he was working. And the Wyeth Olson House. Jean, you're so good to remind me about this. That is also open to the public. It's a National Historic Site, and the Farnsworth Museum operates the tours there. Thank you for mentioning that both of those sites are available to people. And oh, and Grace has added that Bowdoin College is also a free resource. Frank, thanks for your kind words. Oh, Richard, Will Barnett. He was another one that didn't make the cut. I love his paintings. I absolutely love his paintings. They kind of would have fit into Quiet Places, but man, so many great artists in so little time. Thanks for mentioning him, though. Anybody who isn't familiar with his paintings, please look them up. I might have one right at the very end. Oh, no, I took it out. Okay. Oh, let's see here. Nancy says, who did that painting with the woman and the baby and the reflection? That was Ashley Bryan. And this is like a cut paper collage. So he does just gorgeous work. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg in his entire body of work. really fascinating stuff, and an artist very closely associated with Maine. I would definitely recommend Googling Ashley Bryan. Um, let's see. Oh, Ron Braces. I want to go to Maine. George Bellows' work is beautiful. I absolutely agree. Sharon added Leo Brooks. I'm not even familiar with him, Sharon. Thanks for adding that name in. I'll have to check that out. I think we've gotten through most of the questions, comments here. Let's see. Yes, I think we have. I really appreciate everybody's very kind words, and I'm really looking forward to sharing the program on Da Vinci with you next month. Um, yes, Linda, that was Ashley Bryan. I think it's without a T. Okay, thank you again, everybody. It has been an absolute delight, and I'm truly humbled by your kind words, and thank you for letting me do what I love to do. Have a great evening, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.